In 1890, in what was then Cheyenne, in the newly created Oklahoma Territory, a young woman went about daily chores among dirt streets and wooden houses. The region was undergoing the post-land runs transition, with nascent commerce, a post office, a church, and a railroad, while farms and indigenous peoples shaped life on the frontier. In 1888, the photograph of Lily Mae Smith Tucker, daughter of Nimrod Jarrett Smith, records a woman of Cherokee ancestry at a time when indigenous peoples were facing assimilation policies in the United States. The portrait documents the persistence of family and identity ties amid state pressure and the changes of the post-Civil War period. Portrait of Marcia Pascal. Her gaze recalls the history of her lineage, a descendant of Lieutenant Colonel George W. Paschal and connected to Cherokee tradition. She joins two 19th-century trajectories in the United States, the military career and the effects of Indian removal, that shaped families and memories. Portrait of Hattie Tom, a Chiricahua Apache woman made by Frank Reinhardt around 1898, when indigenous delegations were exhibited at the Indian Congress of the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha. The image records a post-Apache Wars moment, marked by reservations and assimilation policies, and preserves features of the group's dress and identity. A photograph from 1890 depicting a young Lakota woman. The record, likely from an itinerant studio on the Dakota Plains, appears at the end of the Indian Wars, the year of the Wounded Knee Massacre. Her gaze and adornments indicate belonging to the Teton people, revealing a childhood under reservation policy and forced assimilation, but also continuity of language and family rights. Sawatanyuk, a young Kwakwakawaku on the northwest coast around 1914, lived among fishing, gathering, and rituals, under the potlatch ban and the pressure of missionaries and residential schools. The image records a generation that maintained the use of cedar, art, and kinship, while negotiating colonial impositions and changes on the Pacific coast. In the photograph, an unidentified girl stands posing with her bowls. Made in platinotype and attributed to Adam Clark Vroman, the piece is dated to about 1860. The record fits into the expansion of 19th-century photography, when printing techniques gained documentary use, fixing everyday scenes and expanding visual archives about anonymous groups. A photograph from about 1900 portrays a teenage girl from a native North American people. Made at the beginning of the 20th century, the image records a period of pressure for cultural assimilation, displacements, and the creation of reservations. Many visual records arose then, tied to ethnographic campaigns, offering clues about ways of life and identities in transformation. Around 1880, Inusk, daughter of a Kickapoo chief, is recorded in this image as part of a generation shaped by removals and migrations. The Kickapoo, originating in the Great Lakes, sought refuge between the United States and Mexico, settling in areas such as Oklahoma and Coahuila. Her lineage expresses the community's political and cultural continuity in that period. Julie Nelson, born in 1886, a woman of Native American ancestry, lived the transition from the 19th to the 20th century under assimilation and land division policies such as the Dawes Act. Portraits like this served ethnographic and census records, while indigenous communities fought for rights, language, and territory. In many places, speech and rights were curtailed. Alice, of uncertain tribal affiliation, possibly Cayuse, Walla Walla, or Umatilla, was likely born around 1900. Her trajectory fits into the period of reservations and assimilation schools in the U.S. Northwest, when peoples of the Columbia Plateau faced loss of territories, political reorganization, and identity redefinitions in photographs and records. Around 1900, basketry by Apache women was a central practice for transmitting knowledge and income in reservations and trading posts. Woven in geometric patterns for ritual and domestic use, the pieces were made with straw, rush, fennel, and cedar strips. At the time, observers called them squaws, a term now recognized as pejorative. In 1910, the photograph of an Arapaho woman records a young member of the Arapaho Nation, a people of the Great Plains. The period is one of reservations and assimilation policies in the United States. Her clothing with beads and hide indicates family status and ceremonial networks. The image documents cultural continuity despite colonial pressures and territorial loss. Minnie Lou Ottinger Bradley, portrayed around 1900, is situated in the passage from the 19th to the 20th century. Her time was marked by urbanization, railroad expansion, and industrialization. Women's suffrage was gaining strength, Jim Crow laws restricted rights, and immigration was altering demographics. Photography and the press popularized portraits like this. The photo, made in 1909 in White Cloud, Kansas, shows Nora Barada Murphy, a member of the Iowa people, whose historic territory encompassed Kansas and Nebraska. Her attire and adornments indicate ties to tribal practices during a period of federal assimilation policies. The image documents indigenous cultural persistence in the early 20th century. Ada Lopez Richards, a Tolowa woman photographed in 1923, bears witness to a moment when peoples of northwestern California and southern Oregon faced assimilation policies in the United States, compulsory schools, and restrictions on rituals. Her image records the continuity of fishing knowledge, language, and basketry, even under legal and missionary pressure. Anna Cash appears as an ethnographic record of the Cayuse. She wears ceremonial clothing with beads and fringes, marking belonging and connection to the land. In 1910, assimilation policies and missionary schools pressured prayers, language, and artifacts, while life on reservations reordered hunting routes and regional exchanges and the partition of lands, allotment. An image from 1908 shows a young woman of the Sioux Nation, Lakota, Dakota, in ceremonial dress of furs, feathers, and beads. Recorded at the height of reservations and forced assimilation in the United States, the scene preserves identity signs of her people. The photograph functions as a historical source on cultural continuity in the face of federal policies. In 1939, a photograph recorded June Welch, a young woman of the Cherokee Nation, wearing ceremonial garments with beads and fringes, according to usages handed down through generations. The portrait functions as a historical document. It shows textile techniques, ornaments, and modes of public presentation, preserving the cultural continuity that shaped her community. Lena Geronimo, daughter of the Apache leader Geronimo, was born in 1886 at Fort Marion, Florida. This occurred in the final phase of the Apache Wars, when captives were taken east by the U.S. Army. The child arrived while her father remained imprisoned as a prisoner of war at that fort, a landmark of displacement and of the federal policy of indigenous confinement. In 1910, a young woman of the Kiowa Nation lived on the Great Plains, especially in Oklahoma, taking part in the group's domestic and ritual life. It fell to her to prepare and preserve food, tan hides, sew garments, produce beads and baskets, care for children and elders, assist in camp moves, and transmit language, songs, and narratives, preserving social cohesion. Around 1900, Josefa Rios, a member of the Tohono O'odham Nation, formerly called Papago, was active in the Sonoran Desert, the U.S.-Mexico border region. In her community, she helped safeguard the language, rituals, and knowledge of water management, cultivation, and crafts, mediating transmission between elders and youth, and strengthening identity continuity. In 1892, a young Kiowa woman is recorded as an example of the group's practices. She wears a ceremonial dress of tanned hide with glass beads and fringes, pieces obtained through regional exchanges. Her presence evidences the continuity of family rites, the learning transmitted by women, and Kiowa adaptation to the pressures of the post-contact period. Juanita Buck, a Dakota Sioux woman active in the 1880s, stood out in her community. She lived through the transition marked by reservations, federal pressure, and assimilation schools. She worked to preserve rituals, teach the language, and sustain ceremonial crafts. As a guardian of collective memory, she mediated generations, recording practices and guiding youth in times of change. Goldie Jamison Conklin, a Seneca woman from the Allegheny Reservation, took part in indigenous community life in the early 20th century. A photograph from 1910 records her figure and situates her within the period's ethnographic documentations. She wears traditional attire with ornamented pieces, beads, and worked fabrics, signaling cultural continuity. Photograph of a princess of the Umatilla tribe in northwestern Oregon, made in 1900. The record was made by Major Lee Morehouse, then known for documenting indigenous communities of the region. The image forms part of the set of portraits that at the time sought to fix identities and modes of dress, amid profound changes imposed by the colonial advance. The chief's daughter is the portrait of Lottie Key Yated, a young woman of the Pueblo Nation in New Mexico, photographed in 1905 by Carl Moon. The work is part of the ethnographic impulse of the early 20th century, when photographers documented indigenous peoples in the face of U.S. expansion. The image captures garments, adornments, and a possibly ceremonial posture, a source for studies of material culture. In 1910, a young Kalispel woman lives between the Pend Oreille and Spokane rivers, in what are now Idaho and Washington. She is part of a Salish people devoted to fishing, hunting, and basketry, with seasonal camps. She faces pressures from reservations and federal schools, preserving language and rituals. She uses cedar canoes and trades furs with settlers and missionaries. A photograph dated around 1904 records a Navajo woman in a moment of tranquility. The smile indicates sociability and agency in the portrait, common in itinerant studios of the Southwest. Attire, hairstyle, and adornments reveal everyday practices and trade exchanges. The framing offers a clue about relations between photographer, community, and era. In 1899, the young indigenous woman La Roche, of the Yakima tribe, became a noted figure in Seattle. Amid a city in transformation, her circulation through public spaces drew attention. Her presence evidences contacts and tensions between native populations and urban society, making her a local reference of the period and shaping perceptions of Yakima culture. A 1908 photograph records Awe Ayu, known as Pretty Flower, a woman of the Seneca Nation. The portrait is part of the period's ethnographic documentation practices and allows observation of garments, posture, and colonial naming. It situates Seneca presence in the early 20th century and suggests tensions between tradition, public representation, and assimilation policies. In 1906, George Bancroft photographed Cow Utis, a Caddo woman. The image, made at a time of federal assimilation policies and confinement to reservations, functions as an ethnographic record. It shows Caddo presence in the plains of the southeastern U.S., with rituals, agriculture, and basketry, tied to territory, cosmology, and collective memory. In 1907, Edward Curtis photographed Lucille, a Dakota Sioux woman. The portrait is part of his project to document indigenous peoples. Lucille appears in ceremonial attire, beaded necklaces, bracelets, and a blanket. The framing highlights the craftsmanship and the reserved posture, marks of identity and cultural resistance in a period of assimilationist pressures. A rare 1894 portrait shows a Kiowa woman smiling, an uncommon gesture in photographs of the period, when serious poses predominated. The image, made on the Great Plains, situates the record within the everyday life of the Kiowa Nation. The clear smile evidences agency and affection in a time of change, preserving the social and historical memory of this people. In 1905, a photograph records a young woman of the Ho-Chunk Nation in Black River Falls, Wisconsin. She wears a plaid shawl with fringe, attire common in the period. The caption identifies her as Kate Thunder Miner. The framing is direct and documentary, emphasizing the subject's presence and the elements of her clothing, useful for studies of material culture. A photograph from 1898 portrays a young woman of the Assiniboine tribe. In a simple framing, the portrait offers a direct glimpse of her identity and the historical cultural context of the late 19th century. The sobriety of the image invites us to observe the young woman and to recognize her connection with the rich Assiniboine tradition of the time. Zit Kalasa, Redbird, an activist and writer of the Lakota people, was active in the early 20th century. In chronicles and essays, she narrated childhood in reservations, education in boarding schools, and the conflicts between tribal values and Euro-American norms. Her texts opened space for indigenous traditions in mass circulation magazines in English. An image dated to around 1900 records a Crow woman outdoors, next to a tent on the outskirts of Sheridan, Wyoming. She wears an elk-tooth dress, a leather belt, and bead necklaces, attire common in ceremonies and daily life. The framing documents the camp environment and indicates clothing practices and domestic organization in that early 20th century. Atra Ason, also recorded as Bertha Thompson, appears in documents as the daughter of Milton James Thompson and Chinawa, a woman of the Yurok Nation. The references located date from 1914, and by placing her in the context of Northern California, allow tracing kinship ties and tribal affiliation, evidencing processes of record-keeping and contact between native and colonial populations. Julia Ann Keka, a woman of the Umatilla tribe, was recorded in an 1880 photograph. The portrait is part of the late 19th century documentation effort when studios and federal agents cataloged indigenous peoples. The image confirms her Umatilla affiliation and serves as a source for studying identity, assimilation policies, and historical memory. A 1900 photograph records a young Native American woman whose identity was not recorded. She wears ceremonial pieces, indicating belonging to community practices and local cosmologies. The portrait allows examination of textile patterns, adornments, and modes of female presentation, serving as a source for studies of indigenous cultures in the early 20th century. Around 1905, Lottie Ki Ya Tede, daughter of the leader of Laguna Pueblo, is portrayed wearing Kawaik attire, a belt, and bead necklaces. The scene is set in the semi-arid belt of west-central New Mexico near Albuquerque, in the territorial period, when ethnographers and photographers intensified the recording of Pueblo ways of life. Dated to 1908 and attributed to Roland Reed, the scene portrays an Ojibwe woman from the Great Lakes region. At the turn of the 20th century, ethnographic photography disseminated standardized images for white audiences, often staged in the studio. Dress, adornments, and posture signal female roles amid colonial expansion and the decline of the fur trade. Photographed by Carl Wernz in 1900 in Hopi Territory, Arizona, the scene shows two girls by an adobe window. In the early 20th century, as railroads and federal agents expanded their presence, the gaze turned outward indicates a childhood situated between the ancestral home and the pressures of contact, railroad tourism, and assimilation policies. In 1878 at Fort Keogh, Montana Territory, the presence of a Cheyenne woman was recorded. The fort, built after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, symbolized the military expansion of the U.S. and the consolidation of the reservation system. In the same period, the Northern Cheyenne Exodus, 1878-79, took place, an attempt to return to ancestral lands. Photograph of Carlotta Chiwiwi with her daughters, Maria and Felicita Tura, members of the Isleta Pueblo community, attributed to the Poli Studio early 20th century in New Mexico on the eve of statehood in 1912. The circulation of these images shaped the public representation of the Pueblo peoples and their relations with Anglo-American society. Photograph of young Hopi girls in Sicomovi on First Mesa, Arizona, taken by Frederick Monson in the early 20th century. It reflects the ethnographic approach of the period, recording clothing, hairstyles, and adornments that marked clan identity and roles in ceremonial cycles. offering visual evidence of social organization and cultural continuity.